You've heard me before quote one of my mentors who told his students that news is what people want to keep hidden. Everything else is publicity. That's why 2 books are rattling the cages of powerful people who would rather you not read them. Here's the first one, Captive Audience, the Telecom Industry and Monopoly Power in the New Gilded Age by Susan Crawford. Read it and you'll understand why we Americans are paying much more for Internet access than people in many other countries and getting much less in return. That, despite the fact that our very own academics and engineers, working with our very own Defense Department, invented the Internet in the first place. Back then, the U.S. was in the catbird seat, poised to lead the world down this astonishing new superhighway of information and innovation. Now, many other countries offer their citizens faster and cheaper access than we do. The faster high-speed access comes through fiber optic lines that transmit data in bursts of laser light. But many of us are still hooked up to broadband connections that squeeze digital information through copper wire. We're stuck with this old-fashioned technology because, as Susan Crawford explains, our government has allowed a few giant conglomerates to rig the rules, raise prices, and stifle competition, just like Standard Oil in the first Gilded Age a century ago. In those days, it was muckrakers like Ida Tarbell and Lincoln Steffens rattling the cages and calling for fair play. Today, it's independent thinkers like Susan Crawford. The big telecom industry wishes she would go away, but she's got a lot of people on her side. In fact, if you go to the White House Citizens Petition site, you'll see how fans of Captive Audience are calling on the president to name Susan Crawford as the next chair of the Federal Communications Commission. Prospect magazine named her one of the top 10 brains of the digital future. And Susan Crawford served for a time as a special assistant to President Obama for science, technology, and innovation. Right now, she teaches communications law at the Benjamin Cardozo School of Law here in New York City and is a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. Susan Crawford, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Captive audience?
Yeah.
Who's the captive?
Us, all of us. What's happened is that these enormous telecommunications companies, Comcast and Time Warner on the wired side, Verizon and AT&T on the wireless side, have divided up markets, put themselves in a position where they're subject to no competition and no oversight from any regulatory authority. And they're charging us a lot for Internet access and giving us second-class access. This is a lot like the electrification story from the beginning of the 20th century. Initially, electricity was viewed as a luxury. So when FDR came in, 90% of farmers didn't have electricity in America. At the same time that kids in New York City were playing with electric toys. And FDR understood how important it was for people all over America to have the dignity and self-respect and sort of cultural and social and economic connection of an electrical outlet in their home. So he made sure to take on the special interests that were controlling electricity then, who had divided up markets and consolidated just the way Internet guys have today. He made sure that we made this something that every American had.
But we are a long way from FDR, the New Deal, and those early attitudes toward industry. What makes you think that's relevant now when you come to the Internet?
You know, this is an issue about which people have a lot of passion because it touches them in their daily lives. The Wall Street Journal on the front page had an article about kids needing to go to McDonald's to do their homework because they don't have an Internet connection at home. Parents around the country know that their kids can't get an adequate education without Internet access. You can't apply for a job these days without going online. You can't get access to government benefits adequately. You can't start a business. This feels to 300 million Americans like a utility, like something that's just essential for life. And the issue of how it's controlled and how expensive it is and how few Americans actually sign up for it is not really on the radar screen.
You describe this, frankly, as a crisis in communication with similarity, you say, to the banking crisis and global warming. What makes it a crisis?
It's a crisis for us because we're not quite aware of the rest of the world. Americans tend to think of themselves as just exceptional. And we're
well,
being
we did invent the internet, didn't we?
We did, but that was generation 1. Generation 2, we're being left far behind. And so all the new things that are going on in the world, America won't be part of that unless we are able to communicate. So there's a darkness descending because of this expensive and relatively slow internet access in America. We're also leaving behind a third of Americans. You call it the digital divide. Describe that to me. Well, here's the problem. For 19 million Americans, many in rural areas, you can't get access to a high-speed connection at any price. It's just not there. For a third of Americans, they don't subscribe, often because it's too expensive. So the rich are getting gouged. The poor are very often left out. And this means that we're creating, yet again, two Americas and deepening inequality through this communications inequality.
So is this why, according to numbers released by the Department of Commerce, only 4 out of 10 households with annual household incomes below $25,000 reported having wired internet access at home, compared with 93% of households with incomes exceeding $100,000? These companies are not providing cheap enough access to the poor folks in this country?
These are good American companies. Their profit motives, though, don't line up with our social needs to make sure that everybody gets access. They're not in the business of making sure that everybody has reasonably priced internet access. That's how a utility functions. That's the way we need to treat this commodity. They're in the business right now of finding rich neighborhoods and harvesting, just making more and more money from the same number of people. They're doing really well at that. Comcast is now a $100 billion company. They're bigger than McDonald's. They're bigger than Home Depot. But they're not providing this deep social need of connection that every other country is taking seriously.
And you make the point that the United States itself is beginning to experience this digital divide in the world.
It's fair to say that the U.S. at the best is in the middle of the pack when it comes to both the speed and cost of high-speed internet access connections. So in Hong Kong, right now, you can get a 500 megabit symmetric connection that's unimaginably fast from our standpoint for about $25 a month. In Seoul, for $30, you get 3 choices of different providers of fiber in your apartment. And they come in and install in a day because competition is so fierce. In New York City, there's only one choice, and it's $200 a month for a similar service. And you can't get that kind of fiber connection outside of New York City in many parts of the country. Verizon's only serving about 10% of Americans. So let's talk about the wireless side for a moment. You know, this separate marketplace that people use for mobility. In Europe, you can get unlimited texting and voice calls and data for about $30 a month. Similar service from Verizon costs $90 a month. That's a huge difference.
Why is there such a disparity there?
The difference in all of these areas is competition and government policy. It's not magical. Without the intervention of the government, there's no reason for these guys to charge us anything reasonable.
So briefly describe the need.
All Americans need a fast, cheap connection to the internet.
And the problem?
A few companies control access in America, and it's not in their interest to bring that fast, cheap access to us all.
And the solution?
The solution is for people to care about this issue, ask hard questions at every debate, make sure you elect people who will act, and give your mayor air cover so that he or she can act to make sure that your city has this fast, competitive access.
The book is Captive Audience, the Telecom Industry and Monopoly Power in the Gilded Age. Susan Crawford, I've enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for being with me.
Thank you so much.